The Greys had gone to the media. They painted me as a deranged woman hellbent on revenge, and that was why I was with Lucian, to make Killian jealous. And now they'd made it publicly known that I had signed away my rights as the mother to my son. Once inside the grand yet eerily quiet estate, Lucian wasted no time. "Give me the divorce and paternity termination agreement." His tone was clipped, businesslike, but there was an underlying tension in his eyes. Even though I was slightly hesitant, I ruffled through my bag and handed him the documents Killian had forced upon me. Lucian took the papers, barely glancing at them before dialing a number. "Come over," he says, his voice giving no room for argument. Lucian leaned against the desk, flipping through the documents I had handed him. His eyes scanned the pages with a cold detachment, but his fingers tightened slightly around the edges. "Did you even read this before you signed it?" His voice was sharp, but not unkind. I crossed my arms, trying to ignore the annoyance bubbling in my chest. "It wasn't like I had a choice, Lucian. Killian made sure of that. I was in a coma. That signature is forged." Lucian didn't respond immediately, but his jaw clenched. Minutes later, the heavy doors of the estate opened, and a man walked in, strikingly similar to Lucian, but with a different aura. Where Lucian was cold and unreadable, the newcomer carried himself with an easy confidence, a mischievous smirk already forming as his gaze landed on Lucian. "What trouble have you found yourself in now, Luke?" the man asked, stepping further inside. I stiffened at the resemblance, eyes darting between them. "Your brother?" I asked, though it's more of a realization than a question. "Roman Blackwood," the man introduced himself smoothly, taking my hand in his and pressing a feather-light kiss against my knuckles. "And who might you be, beautiful?" I blinked in surprise, caught off guard by his boldness. I looked to Lucian on how to proceed, but his expression had darkened ever so slightly. His jaw tightened, and though he didn't outright react, his fingers twitched as if suppressing an impulse. "Enough, Roman," Lucian said in a low, warning tone. Roman chuckled. "Relax, Luke. I'm just being friendly." Lucian didn't look relaxed. "I'm Amelia Walker. Amelia Walker. Nice to meet you, Mr. Blackwood." I greeted. Roman waved his hand as if swatting a fly. "None of that politeness here, sweetheart. Mr. Blackwood is our father." My brow almost raised in surprise. Their father is alive? I thought to myself. His grin widened as he met my eyes. "And you are one beautiful lady. Lucian doesn't bring women to his estates. Must mean you're special." "We're here to discuss legal matters," Lucian finally said, setting the papers down on the desk. Roman released my hand with a dramatic sigh. "Right, business first. Flirting later." I arched a brow, amused despite myself. "You're quite confident, aren't you?" Roman grinned. "It's a family trait, which I think is lost on Lucian." Lucian exhaled sharply, pinching the bridge of his nose. "Just review the damn papers, Roman." Roman took the documents with a casual shrug, but as he skimmed through them, his smirk faded slightly. His eyes flickered to me, then back to Lucian. "Killian really did a number on her, didn't he?" Lucian said nothing, but the look in his eyes was answer enough. For the first time since he walked in, Roman's playful demeanor slipped, replaced by something sharper. He flipped through the papers again. No financial compensation, termination of rights, gag order, morality clause, and ironclad, making it nearly impossible for you to challenge it in court. And the date the documents were finalized, I was in a coma at the St. Mary's Hospital. I added. He met my gaze, something unreadable flickering in his expression. "Well, then. Let's see how we can turn this around. This should be easy." A few days later, after settling into the estate, Lucian suggested a tour. We walked through the vast property, hand in hand. The estate was grand, elegant yet lived in, with dark wood accents and floor-to-ceiling windows that let in the fading evening light. Then we reached a hallway that felt more different. Warmer. More personal. My eyes landed on a large portrait hanging on the wall. The woman in the painting was breathtaking. Long, flowing auburn hair cascaded over her shoulders, framing a face that was both delicate and fierce. Her eyes, sharp and intelligent, held an intensity that seemed to follow me even from the canvas. Her lips were painted a soft red, curved into the barest hint of a knowing smile, as though she held secrets the world would never be privy to. She wore an emerald green dress, elegant and timeless, the color enhancing the vibrancy of her hair. "Who is she?" I asked, unable to tear my gaze away. Lucian stood motionless beside me, staring at the portrait, his jaw ticking ever so slightly. Then, without a word, he gently tugged my hand and led me away from the portrait, as if the answer to my question was something he refused to give. I didn't push, but something about his reaction unsettled me. I wasn't sure what bothered me more, the mystery of the woman or the unexpected pang of discomfort in my chest at Lucian's reaction. I didn't like how I was feeling. Later that night, I wandered into the study, looking for something to read. I couldn't sleep. I closed the door behind me and found Lucian sitting there, a glass of whiskey in hand, his gaze distant. "What do you want?" he asked as I took a step forward. I cleared my throat. "I came for a book. I couldn't sleep." He gestured to the huge bookcases, "Help yourself," and brought the glass of whiskey to his mouth. I walked towards the books, but with my next step, I hesitated. "You never answered my question," I said softly. Lucian exhaled, tilting his glass slightly. "Some questions don't need answers, Amelia. Is she someone important to you?" His grip tightened around the glass, but his voice remained composed. She was past tense. But I wasn't sure if that made me feel any better. I hated the way my mind was going round and round about the portrait. "Is she the love of your life?" I wanted to ask. I hated the way I was feeling about it. I was beginning to hate myself at how my mind wouldn't let it go. Shaking my head, I browsed through the books and settled on a novel. I headed to the door when he stopped me. "Don't leave." His voice was raw. "Huh," was all I said in response. "Sit. Read to me. Help keep the demons at bay." I hugged the book to my chest as I regarded him. He still hadn't turned to look at me. "Woof. Woof," I barked. That caught his attention. A small smile appeared at the corner of his lip. "Please," he finally said. Taking a deep breath, I took the chair opposite him and settled down. I opened the book and started reading out loud. The sun hung lower in the sky, casting a golden glow over Lucian's estate as I stepped out onto the vast terrace. The place was breathtaking. I had spent the day with Roman, going over documents. We had spent almost the entire day locked up in Lucian's office. Lucian had given me space all afternoon, but I could still feel his presence even when he wasn't in the room. It was as if he'd rooted himself in my awareness. I traced the rim of my wine glass, watching the reflection of the setting sun in the deep red liquid. The legal discussion from earlier still lingered in my mind. Roman had been sharp, quick to expose Killian's deception. He had also been irritatingly charming, something Lucian clearly hadn't appreciated. A breeze carried the scent of evening jasmine as I heard quiet footsteps behind me. "You're thinking too hard." I turned to see Lucian, sleeves rolled up, tie loosened, exuding effortless authority. He leaned against the railing, watching me rather than the view. I exhaled a small laugh. "It's been a long day." Lucian studied me for a moment. "You handled it well." I lifted a brow. "Even when your brother was flirting with me?" His jaw twitched. I smirked, sipping my wine. "You don't like it when he pays me attention, do you?" Lucian remained quiet for a beat, then smoothly replied, "I don't like distractions." I rolled my eyes. "Right. Because I'm a distraction." "You are," he admitted, stepping closer. A strange tension settled between us. I wasn't sure when it had started. Maybe it had always been there, simmering beneath our interactions. "You never told me about the woman in the portrait," I said suddenly, changing the subject. I berated myself for bringing it up again. Lucian's expression cooled. I took his silence as confirmation that I'd touched something deep, something off-limits. "She meant something to you, something important." I hated the way that thought unsettled me. Lucian's gaze flickered to the distant hills, as if looking anywhere but at me. Then, just as I thought he wouldn't answer, he said in a low voice, "She was important. Once." And then, without another word, he turned and left me standing there, heart pounding for reasons I refused to acknowledge. We were playing chess a few days after the Terrace fiasco. I looked at the queen and a thought settled in. The next attack should be on Irene Grey, whether Killian likes it or not. His mother is the one at the helm. Irene values her social standing more than anything else, so we should chip at that. I looked up to see Roman and Lucian looking at me with grins on their face. Well, for Lucian it was more of a smirk. Damn, Leah. Lucian is really rubbing off on you. Roman had started to call me Leah and to treat like a little sister instead of a guest or client. Thanks, Rom. I learnt from the best. I made a move before continuing the Imperium Circle, I continued. Those women thrive on power and spotless reputations. If we make them believe Irene is a liability, they'll rip her apart themselves. Roman let out a low whistle. Damn, sweetheart. I like where this is going. Lucian watched me carefully. And what do you propose? I leaned in. We expose her secrets, but not all at once. We plant rumors, whispers of her fraud, her illegal schemes. We make it so that every woman in that group starts doubting whether Irene's presence will stain their image. We let paranoia do the rest. Roman grinned. We feed the wolves and let them turn on her. Exactly. My voice was unwavering. But I don't want to be left out of the process. No more shielding me, Lucian. I want to be involved in every step. Lucian studied me, his jaw ticking. Fine, he finally says. Thank you, I said with a small smile. Now, let's start ruining Irene Grey. The Imperium Circle's annual charity gala for children was an extravagant affair, chandeliers casting golden light over designer gowns, murmured conversations between the country's most influential women, and perfectly poised smiles hiding decades of power struggle. I stepped inside, my brown hair cascading down my back. We had decided that I would take this operation alone with his guards and people. I ignored the looks thrown my way, some intrigued, some skeptical, and one absolutely furious. Irene Grey. From across the room, her eyes landed on me. She excused herself from her circle of guests, gracefully weaving through the crowd, her expression one of forced calm. But the moment she reached me, she grabbed my wrist with just enough force to make a statement. What the hell do you think you're doing here? Irene hissed, pulling me just outside the event hall, away from prying eyes. I arched a brow, completely unaffected. Attending a charity gala, of course. You don't belong here. This place is not for your kind. Irene's voice was low and furious. I don't know what game you're playing, but it ends now. A smirk tugged at my lips. Oh, Irene. You still think you're in control. Irene's control finally cracked. With a sharp movement, she raised her hand and slapped me across the face. The sharp sound echoed in the hallway. My head turned slightly with the impact, but instead of retaliating immediately, I laughed. A rich, amused laugh that made Irene freeze. You really shouldn't have done that, I mused. Then, with a swift, unhesitating motion, I slapped Irene twice, one sharp hit to each cheek. She staggered back, eyes wide in shock. I'm sure no one had ever dared to lay a hand on her like that before. I leaned in, voice soft but lethal. Consider that a little payback for everything. Inside, the event continued flawlessly. The guests enjoying their wine, and soon it was time for the main presentation. The room darkened, and the large screen lit up, ready to display a heartwarming video about the struggles of underprivileged children in need of financial aid. For the first few seconds, the expected footage played, malnourished children smiling through their hardship, donations at work. Then, static. The screen glitched. The audience murmured in confusion as the video abruptly switched. Now on the screen sat Irene Grey, elegantly dressed but visibly irritated, speaking to a woman with red-rimmed eyes. I recognized the woman as Irene's personal assistant. The woman's voice was shaky as she said, but you're embezzling funds from the Imperium. It can help more children. If anyone finds out. Shut up. Irene's voice cut through the recording, sharp and commanding. You will keep quiet or you'll regret it. Those children should be happy with the meager coins I hand over to them. A collective gasp rippled through the room. Then the screen shifted again, this time displaying financial records, showing how Irene had been diverting charity money into personal accounts, transactions spanning years. Gasps turned into whispers of outrage. And then, the final nail in the coffin. Another glitch, and now the screen showed grainy footage of Irene in a private setting using illegal substances. The room erupted into chaos. The moments the light flickered back on, reporters had already slipped inside, drawn by the scent of scandal like sharks to blood. They swarmed Irene, cameras flashing, questions flying. "Mrs. Grey, do you deny these allegations? How long have you been stealing from charity? The Imperium Circle has always upheld integrity. What does this mean for them? Are you going to step down?" Irene, pale as a ghost, stood frozen. Her fellow Imperium women, the same ones who once admired her, were now looking at her in disgust and horror. Amid the chaos, I sat quietly in the back, watching with satisfaction. I raised my wine glass, gave a mocking salute toward Irene, who was too busy drowning in her downfall to notice, and then, without another glance, stood and walked out. The night had gone perfectly. I stepped out of the venue, the cool night air brushing against my heated skin. The sounds of chaos, reporters shouting, people murmuring about Irene Grey's disgrace, faded into the background as one of Lucian's undercover guards smoothly led me to a sleek, black car parked at the back. I opened the passenger door, fully expecting to see another guard waiting inside. Instead, my breath hitched for a moment. Lucian was in the driver's seat. I blinked, momentarily thrown off. "What are you doing here?" He didn't answer. Instead, his jaw was tight, his fingers gripping the wheel in a way that made the leather creak. His eyes, dark and unreadable, flicked over my face. He waited for me to sit, then captured my chin, tilting it toward the car's overhead light. His gaze locked onto the faint mark on my cheek where Irene had struck me. His body stiffened, his grip tightening slightly as something dark flickered in his expression. "She hit you," he said, voice dangerously low. I shrugged, unconcerned. "And I hit her back. Twice, actually." Lucian wasn't amused. His thumb traced the faint mark, his touch soft in contrast to the storm brewing in his eyes. His jaw ticked once, twice, then he muttered, almost to himself, "I'll destroy her." I chuckled, tilting my head. "Isn't that what we're already doing?" He didn't answer. His gaze stayed on my cheek, fingers still lingering, as if he could erase the mark through sheer will alone. His entire demeanor screamed controlled fury, and something about it startled me. I jerked back, breaking the contact. "I can take care of myself," I reminded him firmly, needing to break the tension between us. "I know." His voice was gruff, but it didn't sound like he truly believed it. A snicker came from the back seat. I turned, startled, to find Roman lounging in the shadows, a Cheshire grin on his face. "You did good, Leah," he praised, his tone light, but his eyes sharp with approval. I narrowed my gaze at both men. "What are you two doing here?" Roman stretched lazily. "Mr. High and Mighty here insisted on coming, just in case anything went out of control." I shifted my attention to Lucian, arching a brow. "You were worried?" Lucian just grunted, avoiding my gaze as he started the engine. With a smooth press of the accelerator, he pulled us away from the chaos, his grip on the wheel still tight, like a man restraining himself from burning the world down in revenge. The estate was quiet at this hour, the night air crisp with a faint scent of earth and rain. Roman and I walked along the stone pathway, the sound of our footsteps muffled by the manicured grass. After the chaos of the Imperium Gala, I wasn't allowed to step outside the gates. The reporters had been relentless, swarming the entrance like vultures waiting for fresh blood. "I don't know how long this lockdown is going to last, but I might lose my mind if I have to stay inside much longer," I muttered, kicking at a loose stone on the path. Roman chuckled beside me, hands shoved into the pockets of his dark slacks. "Welcome to the world of being infamous, Leah." I rolled my eyes but didn't argue. The silence stretched for a few moments before my mind wandered back to something that had been bothering me. "The portrait. I've been meaning to ask," I started, glancing at him. "The woman in the portrait inside." Roman didn't answer immediately. His steps slowed, and I felt him glance at me before exhaling softly. "She's beautiful, isn't she?" he finally said. I wasn't sure why I cared so much, but the way Lucian had reacted to the painting, it wasn't just grief. It was something deeper. "Who was she?" I asked, my voice quieter now. Roman stopped walking altogether. I turned to face him, and in the dim light of the estate lamps, I caught the flicker of something unreadable in his expression. "Our mother," he said simply. The realization settled heavily between us. The woman in the portrait was Lucian and Roman's mother. I had 1,000 questions, but only one managed to make it past my lips. What happened to her? Roman looked away, staring into the darkness beyond the estate walls. "She died," he said, voice tight. "And before you ask, no, she didn't just die." A chill ran down my spine. "Lucian doesn't talk about it," I murmured, more to myself than to him. Roman scoffed. "Of course, he doesn't. But it doesn't mean he's forgotten. Some things you never forget or forgive." I hesitated before asking, "How did she die?" Roman was silent for so long that I thought he wouldn't answer. But then he sighed, running a hand through his hair. "It was ruled as," he said finally. "But Lucian, he's never believed that." The weight of those words pressed down on me. "That Lucian didn't believe in? Do you?" I asked. Roman met my gaze, and for once, his usual teasing expression was nowhere to be found. "No," he said. "I don't." A shiver ran down my spine. "Who was the last person to see her alive?" I asked, already dreading the answer. Roman's jaw tightened. "Killian's father," he said. As I walked beside Roman, the cool air did little to calm the storm in my mind. Lucian's mother. A supposed Killian's father was the last to see her alive. It was all starting to make sense, Lucian's hatred for the Greys. And then there was Killian. His loathing for Lucian had always felt personal. Too personal. I recalled Killian's bitter rants. My own father used to call him the son he never had. Had Killian's father favored Lucian over his own son? Had Lucian been a threat to Killian's place even back then? I clenched my fists. Killian had always craved approval. And now I realized it wasn't just hatred in his eyes when he spoke of Lucian. It was fear. And he had every reason to be afraid. Because Lucian wasn't done yet. And neither was I. Every day ended with me in the library reading to Lucian. The room always carried this intense feel, the air thick with something unspoken. I could feel him watching me through the night, his gaze never wavered. I could hear him breathe, slow and measured, but it did nothing to calm the erratic beat of my own heart. One night, I closed my book and looked at him. "Read to me," I said, my voice quieter than I intended. "I want to hear your voice." For the first time, I saw him hesitate. Lucian didn't move at first. His fingers rested on the arm of his chair, unmoving, his gaze unreadable. The firelight cast sharp shadows on his face, highlighting the tension in his jaw. "I don't read out loud," he finally said, his voice rough, controlled. I tilted my head. "Why not?" His eyes flickered, something unreadable passing through them. "It's just not something I do." I studied him for a moment, then leaned forward, resting my elbow on the arm of my chair. "You listen to me read every night, but you won't do the same for me?" Lucian exhaled through his nose, his fingers drumming against the wood. For a long moment, I thought he'd refuse. But then, with an almost imperceptible sigh, he picked up the book I had closed. His voice, when he started reading, was low and rich, a deep timbre that sent a shiver down my spine. His pronunciation was precise, each word deliberate, as if he was tasting them before letting them go. The room felt smaller, the air thicker, charged with something I couldn't name. I closed my eyes, letting the sound of his voice wash over me. I shouldn't feel this way, but I did. My eyelids grew heavy as Lucian's voice weaved through the quiet room, the warmth of the fire lulling me deeper into drowsiness. I fought to stay awake, but his voice was like a spell, pulling me under. Eventually, I surrendered. When I stirred, the world felt hazy, my mind caught between sleep and wakefulness. My lashes fluttered open, and the first thing I saw was Lucian. He was crouched in front of me, his dark eyes fixed on me with an intensity that made my breath hitch. His fingers moved slowly, brushing a loose strand of my hair between them, his touch barely there yet impossibly felt. My heart pounded, my body frozen under the weight of his stare. There was something unreadable in his expression, something dark, something possessive. I don't know how long he had been there, watching me like this, but the realization sent a shiver down my spine. My lips part, but no words come out. Lucian's fingers still. His jaw ticked, and for a moment, I thought he might pull away. Instead, his thumb grazed the edge of my jaw, feather-light, like he was memorizing the shape of me. And then, just as suddenly as I woke up to him, he stood, his warmth vanishing as he turned away. Lucian sat in his study, the glow of his desk lamp casting sharp shadows across his face. His fingers tapped idly against the dark mahogany surface, his expression unreadable. Across from him, I perched on the edge of a leather chair, swirling the amber liquid in my glass, waiting. "The Grey Company is not as stable as they want the world to believe," Lucian finally said, breaking the silence. His voice was low, measured. "They've been bleeding money for a while now, propping up their image with loans and desperate partnerships. The investors are restless, and if things continue this way, the board will be forced to make a move." I raised a brow. "A move? They're looking for a buyer," Lucian said simply. "Killian is still the public face, but he no longer has the control he once did. If someone steps in with the right offer, they'll take it." I stilled, my mind working fast. The thought came swiftly, almost instinctively. What if that someone was me? I set down my glass, leaning forward. "I want it." Lucian's gaze flicked up, studying me intently. "You want to buy Grey Enterprises?" A slow smile spread across my lips. "Yes." There was a brief silence, then Lucian exhaled a short, amused breath. "You don't just want the company. You want to take it from him. Wouldn't you?" I challenged. Lucian tilted his head, his dark eyes gleaming with something almost approving. "I suppose I would." The thought of Killian, the man who had discarded me, stolen my son, and humiliated me, having to watch as I took everything he held dear, it sent a sharp thrill through my veins. "This won't be easy," Lucian warned. "Even with their financial troubles, Grey Enterprises still has influence. Killian will fight this." I leaned back, confidence thrumming through me. "Then let's make sure he loses." Lucian smirked, reaching for his phone. "Roman is going to love this." I stood beside Lucian, eyes locked on the financial reports. Roman lounged nearby, sipping whiskey. "Killian doesn't own the company outright," Lucian said. "The board does. His power is perception. If we shatter that, he's finished." I smirked. "Then let's make them panic." Lucian nodded. "We start with the media, spread doubt about the company's stability. Investors will pull out, stocks will plummet, and the board will scramble." Roman grinned. "That's when we buy quietly, through shell companies. By the time Killian realizes it, we'll own everything." My eyes gleamed. "He won't even see it coming." Lucian stepped closer, voice low. "Are you sure about this?" A shiver went through me as I held his gaze. "I want him to lose." Lucian smirked. "Then let's make him lose." Roman raised his glass. "To the end of Killian Grey." I clinked mine against his. Killian's empire was about to crumble. I always knew Killian loved control. The way he carried himself, the way he spoke, everything was calculated. But now, he was unraveling, and I had the front row seat to his downfall. It started subtly. A whisper here, a leaked document there. The media, always hungry for a scandal, turned on him fast. Headlines questioned his leadership, his company's stability, his personal finances. Investors grew nervous. Stocks plummeted. Then came the meetings. Board members, once loyal, started doubting him. The cracks in his perfect image widened. I watched him from afar, saw the tension in his shoulders, the forced smiles at press conferences. Lucian had been right. Killian didn't own the company, but he thrived off the illusion that he did. And we were tearing that illusion apart. The final blow came when the board voted to sell. Killian fought, of course. He shouted, threatened, tried to rally support. But money spoke louder than pride, and Lucian had made sure every possible buyer was either in our pocket or unwilling to save him. I imagined his face when he learned who the real buyer was. The betrayal he must have felt. He had taken everything from me once, and now I was the one taking it all from him. I should have felt triumphant. I should have laughed. But as I stood in the shadows, watching him storm out of the boardroom, his face red with anger, his fists clenched, I only felt one thing. It wasn't enough. Not yet. Not until I have my son. The fire crackled in the dimly lit study, casting long shadows across the walls. I stood by the window, arms wrapped around myself, the weight of everything settling on my shoulders. The revenge, the victory, it was satisfying. But instead, there was a strange tightness in my chest. Lucian leaned against his desk, watching me in that unreadable way of his. Silence stretched between us, thick with something neither of us wanted to name. "You did it," he finally said, his voice low. "We did it," I corrected, turning to face him. His lips twitched, but the usual smirk didn't come. Instead, he pushed off the desk and strode towards me. Slow, intentional. My pulse quickened with every step he took. When he was close, too close, I tilted my head up to meet his gaze. The air felt charged, humming between us. His hand lifted, fingers brushing the edge of my jaw, his touch featherlight but searing. "Amelia," he murmured, my name a warning, a question, a challenge. My breath hitched. He was so close now, his lips a whisper away from mine. If I leaned in, just a little, a sharp knock shattered the moment. I jerked back, heart pounding. Lucian's jaw clenched, his eyes dark as he exhaled slowly, as if reining himself in. Roman's voice came from behind the door, laced with amusement. "If you two are done brooding and almost doing things, we have business." Lucian sighed, stepping away, jaw ticking, his expression unreadable once again. I swallowed hard, pressing a hand to my chest. What the hell just happened? I wasn't sure. But I knew one thing. I wanted it to happen again. The next time, I'll make sure I boot Roman out first. I remember what it felt like to have nothing. To live in the shadow of people who saw me as nothing more than an inconvenience, a disposable piece on their chessboard. I remember the cold, empty nights when I had no one, when the very man I married left me to rot while he thrived, basking in the wealth and power he had built on my suffering. But now? Now, the tables have turned. The day Lucian and I officially took over Killian's company I expected to find skeletons. I just didn't expect an entire graveyard. The books were a mess, hidden transactions, missing funds, blatant tax evasion. Killian and Irene had been siphoning money for years, their greed bottomless. Stock manipulation, offshore accounts, fraudulent reports, all of it laid bare in the numbers. They thought they were untouchable. They thought their power, their name, would shield them forever. They were wrong. The press devoured them alive. Headlines screamed their crimes across every major publication. Their investors turned on them instantly, filing lawsuits faster than Killian could blink. The once great gray empire? Crumbling, rotting from the inside out. And then came the real blow. Killian's first love walked away. She had been there for the money, for the security, for the power that came with his name. But when he lost everything, she left without a second glance. No loyalty, no love, just cold, calculated abandonment, the same way he had abandoned me. Bankruptcy came next. A slow, agonizing descent into ruin. The Greys, once untouchable, once feared, were officially broke. I watched from a distance as their world shattered, the same way mine had when Killian had thrown me away. But it wasn't over. Roman had been waiting for this moment. The moment when Killian had nothing left to protect him. And now? It was time for justice. The forged divorce papers. The fraudulent paternity termination agreement. Everything he had stolen from me, everything he had taken from my son, he was about to pay for it. I had spent years suffering under the weight of Killian Grey. But now? Now, he would finally know what it felt like to lose. I sat beside Roman and Lucian, my hands resting on the smooth oak table before me. Across the courtroom, Killian and Irene Grey sat hunched over, their once impeccable appearances now hollow reflections of their former selves. Killian, once so proud and untouchable, looked gaunt, his suit hanging off him as if he'd lost too much weight too quickly. Irene, usually polished and poised, had deep shadows under her eyes, her usual sharp presence dulled by exhaustion and defeat. This was it. The moment we had all been waiting for. Roman had been relentless in building our case. He presented undeniable medical records, my coma, the timeline of my hospitalization, the very days that Killian had supposedly obtained my signatures. Forensic analysis of the signatures proves they were forged, Roman stated firmly, pointing to the enlarged documents displayed on the screen. Not only does the handwriting differ in pressure and stroke, but Mrs. Grey was medically unconscious at the time. She could not have signed anything. The opposing lawyer weakly attempted to argue that I could have signed beforehand, but Roman shut them down with hospital surveillance footage, me lying motionless in a hospital bed while Killian and his lawyer finalized the fraudulent documents. The courtroom murmured. The judge's expression remained unreadable, but I could see the tide shifting. Then came the final blow. Roman called in a handwriting expert, who methodically dismantled every argument, proving that Killian had forged my signature to strip me of my legal rights to my son and our shared assets. The weight of it all settled on Killian's shoulders, and I saw it, the exact moment he realized he had lost. Irene placed a trembling hand over her mouth, her composure cracking as the evidence piled up against them. The judge cleared his throat. Given the overwhelming proof of fraud and forgery, I will be ruling in favor of the plaintiff. The divorce and paternity termination agreement are hereby deemed invalid. A sharp gasp rippled through the courtroom. Killian let his head drop into his hands, and Irene gripped his arm, whispering something frantically. But there was no way out. Their lies had finally caught up to them. Justice was mine. The moment had finally arrived. I stood in the middle of the neutral meeting space, my heart pounding so hard it echoed in my ears. Lucian stood beside me, a steady presence, his hand resting lightly on the small of my back. Roman, ever the composed attorney, held the finalized documents, the ones that severed the last remaining ties between Killian and me. Divorce. Parental rights termination. The official end of everything. And then, they brought him out. A small figure in the arms of a familiar nanny. My breath hitched. My son. His tiny curls were dark like his father, his cheeks chubby. His eyes light like mine. He wore a soft blue onesie, his big, curious eyes darting between the strangers in the room. My knees nearly buckled as I took him in, the way his little fingers clutched the fabric of his nanny's dress, the slight furrow of his brow, so much like mine when I was deep in thought. Tears blurred my vision as I took a shaky step forward, my arms already aching to hold him. Would he recognize me? Would he cry? Then, the nanny whispered to him softly. She pointed to me as she approached me. His tiny hands reached toward my face, and in a voice so pure, so innocent, he called out, "Mama." A sob tore from my throat as my knees buckled, reaching for him. The nanny lowered herself and placed him in my arms. The moment his warm little body melted into mine, I knew, despite everything, despite the time lost, my son knew me. The nanny later told me she kept my picture in his room, played recordings of my voice so he'd never forget. And now, as his small fingers clung to my dress, as he buried his face into my shoulder, I knew he hadn't. He was mine. And I would never lose him again. Sebastian was finally asleep. I watched his little chest rise and fall, his tiny fingers curled into the sheets, and my heart swelled with so much love it almost hurt. He was mine. After all these months, after everything, I finally had my son back. With one last lingering look, I stepped out of his room, closing the door softly behind me. The house was quiet, the kind of quiet that made every thought louder, every feeling sharper. I made sure Roman had left for the night before heading toward the library. I knew Lucian would be there. When he saw me, he didn't say a word. He just lifted his free hand and beckoned me forward. I went without hesitation, letting him pull me onto his lap. He wrapped his arms around my waist and buried his face in the crook of my neck, exhaling deeply. How are you? His voice was quiet, but I could hear the weight behind it. It's surreal, I admitted, running my fingers through his hair. After almost 12 months of fighting, I finally have my son back. He hummed in response, but he didn't say anything else. He just held me. I let the silence stretch between us, knowing he wasn't just asking about me, he was trying to find the words for something else. Then he finally spoke. That portrait, it's my mother. I shifted slightly, but he didn't say anything. She had an affair. His voice was steady, but there was something raw underneath. With Killian's father. My father worked as his secretary, so we lived in one of their goose houses on their estate. A cold shiver ran down my spine. I caught them, he continued. Again and again. His hand tightened on his glass, his knuckles turning white. The night she died, I caught them in Killian's father's library. I fought with him. I yelled at her. Then I left. He swallowed hard. And I saw Irene. My breath hitched. She was there. Lurking, watching me storm out. He finally lifted his head, his dark eyes meeting mine. Minutes later, I heard a scream. I turned around and saw my mother falling from the 3rd floor. Head first. I was just 15 years then. A sharp pain twisted in my chest. Irene had a hand in it, Lucian said, his voice quieter now, but filled with certainty. I know it. I didn't think. I just reached for him, cupping his face between my hands. He was always so strong, so in control, but right now, in this moment, I could see the boy he used to be. The one who had lost his mother in the most horrific way and never had the chance to grieve. Lucian, I whispered. He exhaled, shaky and uneven. I pressed my lips to his forehead, then his temple, lingering there, letting him feel my warmth. I'm sorry, I murmured against his skin. You've carried this alone for too long. Lucian closed his eyes, his arms tightening around me. For once, he didn't fight it. He just let me hold him. Sebastian Blackwood. Lucian said it like a vow, his voice deep and certain, his fingers tracing slow circles along my back. Then he murmured, almost as if testing the words, Amelia Blackwood. He let the name settle between us, the weight of it pressing against the quiet air of the library. It has a nice ring to it. I stilled against him, my pulse skipping in response. Slowly, I pulled back just enough to see his face, searching for any sign of teasing, but his expression was unreadable, calm, yet holding something deeper beneath the surface. Are you asking me out, Mr. Blackwood? I asked, tilting my head slightly, my voice barely above a whisper. Lucian didn't answer with words. Instead, he chuckled softly, the sound rich and deep, vibrating through me. Then, without hesitation, he pulled me even closer, as if there was no world beyond this moment, beyond the space we occupied together. His warmth surrounded me, his breath ghosting over my skin. You already belong to me, he murmured against my hair, his lips brushing so lightly that a shiver ran through me. And I belong to you. My throat tightened. For so long, I had been fighting. Fighting for my son, for my freedom, for a life that wasn't dictated by the past. And Lucian had been there through it all, steady, unwavering, never asking, never demanding. Just there. I had always known. I leaned back slightly, my hands resting on his chest, feeling the steady, reassuring rhythm of his heart. I love you, Lucian. His expression softened, the sharp edges of him melting into something gentler. A flicker of emotion passed through his dark eyes, relief, understanding, something unspoken yet undeniable. Then, he cupped my face, his touch reverent, as if I were something precious, something irreplaceable. I love you too, Amelia, he said, and I could hear the truth of it in every syllable. No hesitation. No doubt. Just him. Just us. A slow breath escaped me, the final weight I had been carrying for so long slipping away. I'm officially divorced, I whispered against his lips. And then, I kissed him.